going on a medieval crusade is often imagined as the ultimate man's mission. A holy military enterprise where only armored knights could fight, while women were expected to stay behind, mind the children, sow, pray, and generally be oppressed until their brave husbands returned home from defending the Holy Land. But that picture? Completely wrong. Women absolutely took up the cross and joined the Crusades. And not just the noble, battle-ready queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, that fascinating figure described as essential yet often despised by chroniclers. Before we go further, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far across the world these forgotten stories of history are reaching. No, the Crusader ranks also included an entire supporting cast of women. Servants tending the animals, washerwomen cleaning blood-stained tunics, camp-following prostitutes who kept morale from collapsing, and yes, even the humble lice-pickers who waged a quieter war against medieval hygiene disasters. Women and Crusades were like a troublesome marriage. You couldn't really have one without the other. The Crusades were not just chivalric epics but messy, human dramas, and women were an insufferable necessity. The Crusades were a series of holy wars that began in the late 11th century with the First Crusade. At this point, commercial and economic growth was transforming Christian Europe, and the Catholic Church, eager to expand its spiritual and political reach, launched these campaigns to retake Jerusalem and the surrounding lands from Muslim rule. But the fighting wasn't limited to the Holy Land. Across the Iberian Peninsula, Christian kingdoms like Aragon and Leon were pushing southwards into Muslim-ruled Al-Andalus. Merchant powers like Genoa and Pisa were harassing North African coastal cities. And the Church sanctioned dozens of military campaigns not only against Muslims, but against anyone labeled heretical, from the Cathars in southern France to the Hussites in Bohemia. The word crusader is actually a modern invention. Medieval people would have simply called themselves pilgrims, seeing their bloody expeditions as an act of holy devotion, a defense of sacred ground. So, did women fight? Surprisingly, yes. From historical records, we know that at least 91 women took up arms between 1095 and 1291 in the Great Crusades of the Middle East. Chroniclers on the Muslim side even used the presence of these women as propaganda, claiming it proved the moral depravity of the Christian invaders. More commonly, women traveled east alongside their husbands, and while many knights saw them as a logistical headache, slowing down the march and draining supplies, these women were also crucial to the survival of the army. And what about the women who stayed behind? Their role was no less critical. Some had to find ways to fund their husbands' campaigns, pledging land or treasures to support the Holy War. Others stepped into what had been considered exclusively male duties, managing estates, settling disputes, even defending property in their husband's absence. During the First Crusade, the Catholic Church officially approved only one female role, washerwoman. And there was a catch. To prevent temptation among the holy warriors, these women were required to be, well, unattractive. The logic was as medieval as it gets. The soldiers were fighting a sacred war and needed to remain pure in both thought and deed. An attractive washerwoman, apparently, was considered a dangerous threat to their salvation. This misogynistic attitude toward women also meant they often took the blame when a campaign went poorly. In some cases, women were banished entirely from crusading camps, accused of distracting the soldiers from their divine mission. Of course, that didn't stop prostitution from happening. It simply made it more secretive, more condemned. Women were more than just companions or distractions. Many became active participants in the war economy. Some acted as settlers, selling provisions like fish, vegetables, and bread to soldiers. Others were hired specifically to pick lice from the men's hair. A grim but absolutely necessary service in an army where disease could kill more quickly than any sword. The chronicler Albert of Aachen, who wrote about the First Crusade, even described how skilled women helped carry the materials and weave the panels needed to build siege engines during the brutal siege of Jerusalem in 1099. By the time of the Fourth Crusade in the early 13th century, women's contributions were no longer just tolerated. They were recognized as an integral part of the war effort. These weren't just silent companions in the background. They were logisticians, healers, workers, and sometimes warriors in their own right. Given a share of the spoils, even some nuns found themselves swept into the tide of the Crusades, traveling alongside priests and bishops on their way to the Holy Land. Other women performed humbler but no less powerful roles, carrying water to the soldiers as they marched, their prayers and wails echoing behind the army like a living chorus, begging heaven for the safe return of the men they loved. And some women went beyond prayer. It is very likely that certain women tended to the wounded on the battlefield, turning blood and mud into makeshift infirmaries. One name we know is Maestre Hen of Paris, a rare glimpse into the life of a truly remarkable medieval woman. She accompanied King Louis IX of France on the Seventh Crusade in 1249, serving not as a follower but as a physician. She treated not just the King and Queen Margaret but also the common camp followers who were often ignored by the nobility. For her loyalty and skill, she was rewarded with a life pension of 12 pence a day, a generous sum that shows how indispensable she was. But let's go further. Let's meet some of the women whose stories leap from the dusty chronicles of history. These were the women who defied expectation, who took up the mantle of men either by managing estates back home or by setting out on their own dangerous, spiritual adventures. One of the most fascinating was Margaret of Beverley, sometimes called Margaret of Jerusalem. Born in the Holy Land in the mid-12th century, she was not of noble blood. Her parents were ordinary English pilgrims. After returning to England, the family settled in Beverley, Yorkshire, where Margaret's younger brother, Thomas, was born. Tragedy struck early. By the time she was 11, Margaret had lost both parents and was left responsible for raising her little brother. When he was old enough, Thomas entered the household of none other than Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, before becoming a monk at a Cistercian monastery in France. With her brother safely cloistered, Margaret was free to follow her own path, and it was not a quiet one. According to her brother's account, she took the cross, vowing to serve Christ, and returned to Jerusalem, the land of her birth. No formal crusade was happening at the time, so it is likely she went as a pilgrim. But fate had other plans. In 1187, Saladin, the formidable sultan of Egypt and Syria, laid siege to Jerusalem, and Margaret, who had traveled so far seeking peace, suddenly found herself in a city under attack. Thomas's writings tell us that Margaret didn't simply hide and wait out the siege. She acted. She carried water to thirsty soldiers and, in a moment of near-mythic courage, supposedly fashioned a helmet out of a cooking pot and joined the defenders on the walls. Her own words, as recorded by Thomas, are striking. Like a fierce virgin, I tried to play the part of both man and woman. I was terrified, but I pretended not to be afraid. Whether every detail is literal truth or partly shaped by Thomas's imagination is hard to know. Medieval chroniclers often struggled with the idea of female warriors. They preferred women to be helpless saints rather than fighters. But what is clear is that Margaret was wounded in the leg and scarred by shrapnel when a millstone was hurled from the walls. Jerusalem eventually surrendered to Saladin, who allowed the city to capitulate with relatively little bloodshed. The Crusaders were ransomed, 100,000 dinars for 20,000 lives, and Margaret left the city with the other freed captives. But her trials were far from over. She was captured by Muslim forces once again, this time spending 15 brutal months as a slave, beaten and humiliated. When finally ransomed by a Christian burgher, Margaret did not return home in defeat. She made a pilgrimage to the tomb of Saint Margaret of Antioch, only to be captured a second time and enslaved again. Eventually freed once more, she traveled through Europe visiting holy sites, and finally reunited with her brother in France. Margaret became a nun, perhaps seeking peace after a life of war and captivity. Thomas, deeply moved by his sister's courage, wrote her story so she would not be forgotten. She died around the 1210s, her life a testament to resilience and faith. Then there is the unknown nun, whose name has been lost but whose fate lingers like a ghost in the chronicles. She left her monastery of Santa Maria in Trier, Germany, and joined the People's Crusade, an early, chaotic movement before the First Crusade officially began. Led by Peter the Hermit, this disorganized army of zealots was no match for the professional Muslim forces. When the Christians were annihilated at the Battle of Civitate in 1096, the nun was taken prisoner. But her story took a shocking turn. After her release, she eloped with one of her Turkish captors, abandoning her former life entirely, and she was not alone. Many wives traveled with their husbands on crusade. One of the most famous was Godhilda, a Norman noblewoman and wife of Baldwin I, the first king of Jerusalem. Godhilda died during the First Crusade, but her presence shows us that these journeys were not strictly a man's world. These stories remind us that medieval women were not just passive onlookers to history. They were participants, sometimes healers, sometimes prisoners, sometimes fighters, sometimes even lovers, caught up in the swirl of faith, blood, and destiny that was the Crusades. In the dusty plains of Anatolia, while Baldwin was marching to Chissa in 1097, tragedy struck. Emmeline, who had faithfully followed her French husband, Sir Fulk of Bohun, suddenly found herself thrust into a nightmare. Her husband was captured and later executed during the brutal siege of Antioch, and Emmeline was taken as a wife by a Turkish mercenary. She was not the only one whose life was forever altered by the Crusades. Many women took up the cross themselves, some standing shoulder to shoulder with their husbands in battle, others striking out on their own. Some were peasants, others royalty, but all of them carried the same fire, the desire for salvation, adventure, and purpose. And among these women were figures who left their mark on history, none more famous than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was no ordinary noblewoman. She was a powerhouse of medieval Europe, Duchess of Aquitaine, heiress to the largest and richest province of France, and a woman whose political influence would shape generations. She wasn't content to sit in a castle and wait for news of war. No, Eleanor took the cross herself, journeying with her husband, King Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade in the mid-12th century. The call to arms came after the fall of the Crusader state of Edessa to the formidable Turkic ruler Zengi. Eleanor not only joined Louis but personally recruited around 300 women to accompany the crusading army. By 1147, somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 pilgrims and crusaders were on the march, their sights set on reclaiming the Holy Land. When the army reached Constantinople, Eleanor didn't merely play the role of a quiet queen. She acted as a diplomat, exchanging letters with the Byzantine empress. And from the writings of Byzantine chroniclers comes one of the most striking images of the Second Crusade. A mysterious woman warrior, clad in armor, riding fearlessly on horseback. Many believe this was Eleanor herself, defying every expectation of what a queen should be. Though the Second Crusade ultimately accomplished little in the Holy Land, Eleanor's personal life was shaken as much as her military campaign. Her marriage to Louis crumbled, ending in divorce just a few years later. But Eleanor's story didn't end there. She married Henry II of England, becoming one of the most powerful women of the medieval world and giving birth to Richard the Lionheart, the legendary king who would himself lead the Third Crusade. Another remarkable crusading woman was Margaret of Provence, Queen of France and sister to Eleanor. Margaret's courage was tested like few others. She accompanied her husband, King Louis IX, on the Seventh Crusade, and while in Egypt, gave birth to her son, John Tristan. But what followed was even more extraordinary. Louis was captured, his brother killed, and the Crusaders' cause seemed lost. It was Margaret who stepped into leadership, negotiating for her husband's release, organizing food for the starving Christians trapped in Damietta, and persuading demoralized Crusaders to hold the port city rather than flee. Chronicler Jean de Joinville describes Margaret's bravery in harrowing detail, even recounting how she asked the knight guarding her bedchamber to kill both her and her newborn son should the city fall. She is remembered as the only woman in history to lead a crusade, a fact that shows just how exceptional her courage truly was. Then there is the haunting tale of Countess Ida of Hainaut. Ida was married to Baldwin II, Count of Hainaut, who sold off many of his possessions just to take the cross and march to the Holy Land during the First Crusade. After the bloody siege of Antioch in 1098, Baldwin was sent with the knight Hugh of Vermandois to Constantinople to seek Byzantine support. But Baldwin never arrived. Somewhere in Anatolia, he disappeared after an attack by the Seljuk Turks and was presumed dead. Ida refused to accept this fate. She made the dangerous journey to the Holy Land herself and organized a search for her missing husband. But she too vanished, never to be seen again. Legends grew around her fate like ivy on an abandoned castle wall. Some swore she had been captured and taken deep into the harem of a Muslim ruler, where she bore him a child. Others went further, whispering that she became the mother of Zengi himself, the Muslim commander who would later capture Edessa and ignite the Second Crusade. Whether these tales are history or just medieval gossip, Ida's story perfectly captures the danger, uncertainty, and fascination of the age. And she was not alone. Whether they were queens leading armies, nuns trudging barefoot on pilgrimage, or desperate wives crossing continents in search of lost husbands, these women shared the same fire as the men they followed. Taking the cross was never just a ritual. It was a declaration, a way to seek salvation through courage, through faith, and through daring action. Their presence was everywhere, in the dust of battlefields, in the hushed prayers over fallen soldiers, in the secret councils where the fate of kingdoms was decided. They were not passive observers. They shaped the Crusades just as surely as any sword-wielding knight. What do you think? Were these women driven more by faith, love, or sheer survival? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and I'd love to know how you see their role in this brutal, fascinating chapter of history. If you enjoyed this dive into the forgotten lives of Crusader women, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this video. It helps keep Vassal Truths growing so we can uncover even more stories the history books barely whisper about. Stay curious. The past has so many secrets left to tell.